Good Saturday morning. I would like to welcome you to the Pinellas County Libertarian Party's Coffee Talk. We have the former LNC chairman, Nicholas Sarwark, who's now with the Libertarian Policy Institute, joining us today. This is our second such event, and I want to make sure that everybody is aware that these now happen on the second Saturday of the month. When we get to the Q&A section, you'll notice that this right here is going to change to remind you about our next one coming in May. For those who are watching this after the fact, I really would like to see you join us so that you can have questions answered. As you'll see after Nick's remarks, we'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll hang around and we'll actually be drinking our coffee. So with no further ado, Mr. Nicholas Sarwark.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's been a real pleasure to not be chairman of the Libertarian Party anymore. And starting the Libertarian Policy Institute is something I know I had talked to you about it while it was still in the thought processes back in summer of 2019. I saw that I was on the fence about whether or not to seek a fourth term as chairman of the party. As we got farther along and I saw the field develop, I decided, not to seek a fourth term, to let somebody else have that privilege and all the things that come with those privileges. And I wanted to focus on something that would give me a way to continue the messaging and the kind of things that I had learned from my time at the head of the party, working with candidates, working with organizations, building coalitions, learning how to speak the language of various groups in order to get libertarian ideas to resonate with them in the language that they understood. And that ability, they talk about it in linguistics, to code switch, to be able to say the same thing in a way that is better received by the audience that you're with or in the community that you're in. I think that as libertarians, we sometimes put that down the priority list pretty far in tailoring how we speak to the people we're speaking to, in observing courtesies or conventions of the communities that we're in that are some minor inconvenience. All courtesy, all etiquette is an inconvenience, but it's the kind of inconvenience that gets you a little farther in the door, right? You're not banging at the door like a traveling salesman. You've actually been invited inside. You're able to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and then, have a conversation rather than that antagonist way of interacting that really defines politics. And that was the other piece with the Libertarian Policy Institute, is I didn't want to go full Cato or Mises Institute, just theoretical think tank kind of stuff, dry papers, very detailed analyses of policy that are designed more to convince a committee or a board or a legislator. It's too wonky, really. But I also didn't want to go to the level I had come out of with the party, where it's just pure politics. Electoral politics is very much short, snappy sound bites, a lot of attacks, a lot of positive and negative messaging. And the score that you keep in electoral politics is votes, right? You either get more votes or you don't get more votes. And votes don't care whether or not they share your principles. Votes aren't principled things. Votes are just an indication of support. They're like a price signal in economics. Every one of us, when we go and buy something at the grocery store, we're voting. We vote all the time in every way, in every market that we interact in. This particular one has a couple extra rules, and you have to register ahead of time. And in some states, you have to show ID. But really, it's just that same thing. It's the price signal, which, as a small aside, a lot of people say, well, your individual vote doesn't matter. It's true. In the same way that your individual purchase of Oreos instead of Hydrox at the store doesn't really matter, but it's the only thing that matters at the same time. It's an aggregate function that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. So electoral politics is too rough, too much focused on conflict, too attack-oriented, and traditional think tanks are too removed and in the ivory tower and talking about the theory rather than the application. So I wanted to take a page from things like Stoicism and virtue ethics, the idea that philosophy is not about what you think, it's about what you do. And if you show me what somebody does, I can tell you a lot more about them than listening to hours and hours of their podcast episodes. That just tells me what they say. But if you watch what actions they take, you learn a lot more about people. Same with politicians. You know, if you look at politicians and their speeches, they very seldom match the actual votes, what policies they put in place, what things they will vote against or vote for, who they'll take money for. Those are the things that tell you a lot more about people and politicians. So the Libertarian Policy Institute aims for that middle ground where we are talking about solutions to problems that people already have. And these have to be problems that they perceive that they have, right? A lot of libertarians and other people from other political stripes have a real good sense of what's important to them, what problems they think are the most important in the world, and they spend a lot of time trying to convince other people that their problems are not the most important, that in fact it's my problems that are the most important, and that other people are not awake to the fact that, to pick an example, bombing brown people overseas is the most important thing that possibly could be. And if you're not exercised about this problem, you're already wrong, right? And that conversation starts out on the wrong foot because you're trying to convince somebody else who doesn't know you that their values are incorrect, that they should really share your values. And you haven't built any trust. So LPI looks at it from the other end. And we look at what are problems that people, large chunks of people, 80% solution kind of people, you know, the vast middle of America that doesn't really like the two old parties, doesn't like red versus blue, doesn't like spy versus spy, just wants to have a better life. What are the problems that they perceive as the most important? And what are ways that we can solve those problems in a way that, to borrow something from someone we know, Chris Rufer, reduce the amount of coercion in the system and increase the amount of persuasion in the system, right? So we want to solve the problem. We want to have the trash be picked up, have the roads, have the potholes filled, have there be less gun deaths, have there be less drug overdoses, fix the opioid crisis, have fewer homeless people, stop bombing brown people overseas. We want to fix all these problems, but we want to fix them in ways that do not add to government force, do not add to people being coerced into doing things, but do add to people being empowered to make good choices for themselves and others, and to require that these solutions they have to be attractive enough that they don't need the force to implement. And that is, I think, the key in getting us farther down the field, is to provide those tools to those advocates who are out there in the world, whether they be libertarian candidates like Ricky Harrington, who's going to be running for governor in Arkansas in 2022, or Jeff Hewitt is going to be running for governor in the recall election in California, which actually comes up later this year. You know, those kind of candidates need these tools. And if we give them these tools, which are these, if you look at Libertarian Policy Institute and some of the articles that are up there, there's simple solutions to these problems that focus on realigning the incentives. Because if the incentives in the system are better aligned, people will make better choices without having to go in and constantly fix the thing that's broken and fix the thing that's broken on top of that. So one of the papers we just recently did was how to fix the broken education system in America. Everybody knows, Morgan knows, she's getting into the law school debt. I'm still paying mine off well over a decade out of law school. The way we finance higher education in this country is just broken. And so we really look at what are the root causes of it, who's actually benefiting from the system we have now, and where can we change some of the incentives so that the system corrects itself? like a self-regulating system of a machine where it has a sensor that tells it, hey, I'm a little out of whack. I have to back off a little bit and recalibrate. We need those guide rails in our society, but they don't have to be government-based. So the problem in higher education, really, and I'm going to distill a whole paper into the nutshell, is that the consumer of the education, the student, is an afterthought. They're an afterthought in the system. The consumer has to go through all the hoops that meet the needs of the government, meets the needs of the financial sector that finances higher education, meets the needs of the administrators and professors at the university, meets the needs of the employers outside of the university. And so the consumer is just a cog in that machine without any real power to say, this isn't really meeting my needs. This isn't doing what I want. And so there's a lot of simple innovations like putting some skin in the game with college or higher education financing, where rather than financing it on the model we have now, where if you take out a student loan, it's one of the only debts that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. It will follow you for the rest of your life because the government made a deal with the banks that you'll never be able to get out from under that debt. If we just switch that to something more along the lines of, the payment is a repayment of some amount of the principal plus a percentage of what you make in the first 5 years out of school. And then after those 5 years, it becomes uncollectible. Well, that changes all the incentives because now the educational institution has a real incentive to make you into a person who can make enough money that that debt actually pays well, right? The bet starts to work for both sides instead of just working for one. And it's those kinds of analyses that we want to spread out into the world. And as a 501c4 advocacy organization, really push to get them put into place and work with political action committees, with 501c3 educational nonprofits, with individuals, with candidates, with anybody really who wants to advance the solutions. And that's the other piece of LPI that is really different from my other work, including a lot of the work I did in 2020, working with candidates on that rough and tumble electoral politics stuff, where we were able to get some really impressive results, but we were still doing that traditional political fighting. LPI doesn't take a strong partisan line. If you're a Democratic candidate or representative or a Republican or an independent or a Green or a socialist or a communist or an authoritarian or whatever you are, if you want to advance these policy solutions in your state or municipality, we're happy to provide you those tools and help get the thing done, because it's not focused on arguments about what's the right answer. It's focused on what will work to make the world better. What solutions will make a better world? And that's how we evaluate our proposals. We look at whether or not they're going to make the world better, not whether or not they are pure libertarian or they're the right priority for people. If that's not your priority, then don't work on that thing, work on something else. But don't get in the way of other people who choose to work on that issue as their priority. The Buddhists like to talk about the idea of the eightfold path up the mountain. There are many ways up that mountain. And just because my way up the mountain doesn't match your way up the mountain is no need for you to spend your time walking around the mountain to the other path to yell at me while I'm trying to get up the damn mountain, right? Stay on your path, I'll stay on mine. And if our paths cross, then hopefully we'll be able to work together. And if they diverge again, hopefully we'll be able to work together when you catch up with me, or, at the top of the mountain, we'll get back together. So that's what LPI is doing. There's a lot going on. Things got backburnered in 2019 because, or not 2019, in 2020, because of the election, the national convention, nominations, and a whole lot of other stuff. We bought a new house. But now that 2021 is here, we brought on Richard Manzo, my campaign manager for county attorney here in Hillsborough County, to do operations and get some of the nuts and bolts of LPI going. We're in the midst of a website rebrand and actually a branding rebrand. We just have new logos coming in. I looked at proofs last night, and we're really going to take a big, strong launch here over this next month or so to get out there and start engaging with the community with some of these solutions. And I'm excited. I'm excited for what comes next, because this kind of work, building people up and helping people solve problems, is the kind of work you need to balance out political or trial work. You know, fighting in court or fighting in the arena of politics is valuable to do, but fighting always takes something out of the fighters, right? That's what makes a good fight, is you leave a little bit of yourself in the fight. Building is the way to recharge those batteries, right? We know we need builders and breakers in this movement, and we need people who are able to shift from one to the other depending on what the task at hand is. I love working with reciprocating saws and jackhammers and sledgehammers, and some people have seen online even axes on occasion. But I also love working with, you know, manufacturing methods like welding and woodworking and fasteners and 3D printing and building stuff up. And you need that balance in your life across all areas of your life if you want to become a better person. And by making yourself better, making the world better. And so that's basically the whole ethos of Libertarian Policy Institute. It's not the only project I'm working on. I'm not sure there's ever been a time I've had only one project to work on. But it is the one that I want to really make sure gets farther this year. And I would love to have the help and support of anybody watching either this morning or on YouTube later. We are looking for support. We're just not at the point where we have a big donation page or anything up there, but it's definitely a project that I think has a lot of value and fills a gap in the libertarian movement that needs to be filled. And maybe LPI doesn't end up being the dominant player in that gap. But right now, I looked at the field and there's nobody in that slot. So we're going to try and fill that slot as best we can until somebody better comes along and takes over for us. And then we'll move on to something else, just like with the party. Is that long enough of a soliloquy?
Hey, I thought it was fantastic. I appreciate it, Nick. One question that I have is, where are you targeting the solutions? Who are you going after when it comes to the policy papers and legislation that would be ideal and the like, when it comes to what you're doing with LPI?
So when you say who are we targeting, like targeting as far as what tone or level of discourse we're going with, or who is our audience?
Are you looking at specific levels of government, city, county, state legislature, federal, and the like?
So I am inspired by people like Kara Schultz out in Burnsville, Minnesota, and Justin Amash's turn towards a Hayekian localism, that a lot of the solutions that people really need in their lives are at the local level, right? I have potholes outside here that it's the mayor here in Manchester that takes care of that stuff. It's not our congressman or our senator that takes care of that stuff. So local is kind of a priority, but national is important too. You know, the racist war on drugs, that filters down to everything else. And so it's important to not differentiate too hard. So we're looking at all areas of all levels of government. As far as the level of analysis we're looking at, we really want to communicate with people the same way you would if you were knocking on doors or tabling at a street fair or just running into somebody at a bar talking about what's going on in your community. We're looking at kind of the level of a newspaper op-ed to a newspaper letter to the editor, somewhere in between that gap, right? We're going to have the right answers, and there's going to be footnotes and resources if you want to really dig into the data. But this is the conversation between you and Mary Jo Sixpack about why the way the schools are structured now isn't helping her kids, and why this way of structuring the schools would probably help her kids a lot more. And you're not trying to get down to that level of, turning her into a Carrie McDonald, where you can just rattle off statistics about schools, or a Jason Bedrick over at EdChoice, right? Those experts are great, and they're really good to get to testify at a board meeting or something. But the hearts and minds are won at the individual level, and you have to approach people where they're at. And this is a lesson I learned from doing a lot of jury trials, is there's no way in the course of a 1, 2, 3 day trial, or even a 2-week murder trial, that you're going to get all of these jurors who came in with their own values, with their own way of growing up, with how they look at the world, and as a defense attorney, convince them to change their mind on everything. All you can really do is find a way to connect your arguments with the values they already hold, and show them how your narrative, your story, your proposal, your argument fits in with how they already are, and give them the tools to come to your conclusion. And you have to let people come to your conclusion. You can't shove people into your conclusion. You can't get people out of the dark cave that they've crawled into, especially over the last year, where they're afraid of a lot of things and they're kind of hiding out. You can't go fight them out of a cave. You have to be outside the cave, having a barbecue in the sun, making a lot of noise, and let them know, hey, everything's cool. Don't worry about it. Nobody's coming to hurt us. You can come out anytime you want. We're not going to push you. You just have to present that positive example. And that also lets you reduce the conflict in the system. If you think of things as systems, if somebody is fighting back against that person adds more conflict, right? The system itself now has more conflict rather than less conflict. So the way that you deal with fighting in a system is you de-escalate the conflict. You take away the resistance, you take away the fight, and you focus only on the good, and you move away from the conflict. And by moving away from the conflict, the people who are still fighting will fall down on their own faces because they can't stop. And then when they get up, maybe they'll catch up with you.
Nick, it looks like you've got a question from Peter.
Okay.
Hey, Nick. Good to
Hi,
see
Peter.
you. So do you envision a membership organization as being part of what you are doing?
So what we envision is, and let me see if I can pull up my draft. I do have it. So we envision essentially a patron kind of model. So we'll be accepting, obviously, just flat donations from people that want to support our work. But we also have various patron levels similar to the Advocates for Self-Government, where at certain monthly levels, we provide more access to the leadership of the organization, the advisory council, the board, various events and tools and trainings for people who are more engaged with the work, as opposed to people who are less engaged with the work. And so the idea is that we want to have ways to recognize the people who are contributing more to the work and make it more collaborative. Like my talk at Freedom Fest this year is about collaborative libertarianism, or collaboratarianism, which is a portmanteau that sort of works and sort of doesn't. It's a little clunky, but the concept is that I want to go back to a Frederick Douglass style of libertarianism, where you'll unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong. And I think that lets us get past some of the toxic cancel culture kind of, just dunking on people, where you're not trying to analyze a person's entire body of work based on some unfortunate thing that they've done that may have been poor behavior. You're rather looking at, is this a project that we can work on productively together? And can we work together on the project without getting deeper into who they are? Very similar to how you would say in medicine. You may not get along with other doctors and nurses as a personal matter, but when you're trying to care for a patient, the mission takes over. And that's actually what makes it easier to work with unpleasant people, is if you have something you need to get done, you sublimate your dislike of the person in service of the goal. And so it's a goal-oriented kind of libertarianism, but we will have patron levels, membership, sort of exclusive inner circle kind of groups, because I believe that the people who support the work should have a voice in what the work is, right? And that's what keeps me aligned with the people who support me, is there's that back and forth communication of, am I still doing work that you approve of? Is there anything I could improve in how we're doing the work? Which is not to say that, there may be a point where that becomes misaligned. And, maybe you're a patron for a year or two, and then you say, look, you went the wrong way on this thing. I'm just not able to be on board. Well, that's a decision point for both of us. Am I going to modify my work to keep your support? Or are you going to support me in spite of it? Those are decisions that we all get to make, but we all make them voluntarily. Nobody's coercing anybody. It's the same way I draw up all my consulting contracts with 30-day out clauses, no fault, both sides. If the contract's not working for me and it's not working for you, or vice versa, doesn't matter. We just walk away friends, because it's better to walk away friends than it is to kind of try and jam somebody up and force them to continue a contract that's not productive anymore. Did that answer your question?
I think so. I'm glad you mentioned the advocates for self-government, because, in a bygone era, Christina and I were quite involved in that organization, and I see some similarities,
yeah,
and some differences, and it's good to be able to build on what people have done before.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I just got a book for Joel when he turned 9. Ryan Holiday wrote a children's book about the childhood of Marcus Aurelius, and when Rusticus was educating Marcus, he made the point that the reason that we study books, the reason that leaders have to read, is it allows us to take lessons that were hard won by people who came before us and learn things more easily than they did. And that's what allows us to, as Newton said, stand on the shoulders of giants, where we don't need to burn our own hands on the stove because somebody wrote down a nice book about burning your hand on a stove, and it's a lot less painful.
That's funny, because that's exactly what Jocko Willink said on Jordan Peterson's podcast a couple of days ago, about being able to take somebody's, and Jordan Peterson also, takes, 30-year career of hard-won lessons, and insights, and it's written down, and all you have to do is like spend a week to read it, and then you can pick up where that person left off.
Yeah, it's very good.
Hey guys, I think we're of the size that we can just kind of interject when we have a question. So I don't know that we necessarily need to worry about raising and lowering hands and the like. So if you guys have a question, go ahead. I think James just unmuted, so it looks like he's got one.
Yeah, Nick, you mentioned a term for collaborating with like-minded groups that we may or may not fully agree with, but there's an issue that, we all get along with and we can come together and work on. And it was, I was going to write it down because, I'm fully for that. That's one of my goals this year is to in Southern Florida, create as much collaboration as possible, not only with the Libertarian affiliates and BCOX and Florida, but, anyone who, say, for example, later this afternoon wants to stand up against vaccine passports or something like that.
Right.
But you called it like collaborationism.
Collabortarian. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. Spread it around as far as you want. It's, it's open to the world to use. And the idea with that is it lets you set your own boundaries, right? I know different people have different sort of bright lines for things they don't want to get involved in, right? And we saw some of this with the whole Black Lives Matter. That's an organization. I went and marched in Minneapolis around like last summer around the whole George Floyd killing. And, we're marching and chanting, and there were 4 things that they were chanting about. And 3 of them I agreed with, and the 4th one I didn't. I'm sure you know that the 4th one or you could guess it. But, you know, there's a lot of chanting about ending capitalism. And that's not really something I'm down with, but I'm not going to leave a march about injustice because there's a fourth thing that I don't agree with some of the other marchers about. And I think that people who focus on the points of disagreement block themselves from some really productive collaboration. You know, I think that you can acknowledge that some of the leadership inside Black Lives Matter as the nonprofit organization has training in Marxism and is proud of that training in Marxism without adopting Marxism. And the way a collaboration can work well is at the outset of your organization. If you know you're an official in it, just say, these are the things that we agree on that we're working together with this group on. And so you define your participation with your own boundaries, right? You don't make them take your own boundaries. They can still chant about how they hate capitalism or the nuclear family or whatever goofy thing that they like, because that's kind of like you may have some ideas on gun rights that they think are equally bizarre. But if you guys can work together to stop cops from shooting Black people, that's probably pretty good, right? That's a worthwhile thing to work even with some people that, you know, if we're going to talk about economics, we're not going to have a good conversation. Or maybe we'll have a better one, honestly, because if we work together on a project that we have built some trust in, maybe that conversation isn't going to be a bunch of name calling and bullshit. Maybe that'll be a real honest conversation about, hey, I can see how you look at the world. That's a little different from how I look at the world. But because, and this is why libertarian collaboration works better, because we agree we're not going to use the government to force you to look at the world the way I want to look at it, or vice versa. We actually have better conversations because they're safer, right? That's what a real safe space is. It's not where you're not exposed to bad ideas. It's not banning critical race theory in the schools. A real safe space is where the ideas can be talked about as ideas without the threat, implicit or explicit, that the government's going to come and implement forcibly whichever ideas win, right? That raises the stakes and makes people feel very unsafe. But I can go have a conversation at a bar with somebody who believes exactly the opposite of me on everything. And as long as none of us get to, you know, swearing at each other or insulting wives or girlfriends or mothers, it's never going to turn into a fight. Might get a little loud, but it's not going to be a fight, because we know that we're safe in our own views and our own way of looking at the world. We don't have something to prove to each other. Does that make sense, James?
Yeah, and I'm looking at this in the same way, maybe from another angle as well. And you kind of touched on it, but if I have, you know, a few libertarian groups that all agree on the same issue, and then I have another fairly large activist group in South Florida that agrees on the same single issue, and we can work together on this issue, it kind of shows our local government and maybe the state government that it's not just the libertarians that they can go after. This is a collaboration between a lot of people in South Florida, not just one single group. So it makes it harder for them to dismiss, you know, oh, those are just the crazy libertarians over there again.
Right.
So yeah, I agree with that, and I fully believe in collaborating as much as possible on single issues without giving up our principles. You know.
Right. And so I want to bring up something unpleasant, if that's okay with everybody. There were some very offensive messages used by some state party affiliates with regard to the vaccine passport issue. And just to make it clear for everybody, I don't support mandatory vaccines. I don't support mandatory vaccine passports. I'm opposed to both of those things. But the way that these state affiliates chose to message on the issue was lazy and counterproductive. And I'm gonna hit both of those things at once. They reference back to previous instances of governmental oppression of people. One with the Holocaust, one with Jim Crow segregation. And they did it for a pretty obvious reason. Those are terrible things that everybody agrees are terrible. And so they were trying to take this issue that they care about and use the outrage about the old issue to convince people to be on the same page with them without going through the persuasive thing of trying to connect with them, explain why this is important. They didn't, it's cheap heat, right? You're just pissing people off to piss people off. The problem with it being lazy is that there are people who have real feelings about those previous injustices, the really big injustices, and it offends them when you're trying to take their family or friends or ancestors' pain and apply it to your issue, right? You're taking something that's theirs and using it for your purposes, and that makes them upset, and it makes it harder for them to actually hear the message underneath. And there was a discussion between a rabbi in Louisville and a famous podcaster about what the issue was, right? Why this is a problem. And the interesting thing was the rabbi actually shared the same position on vaccine passports and mandatory vaccination and government control, but instead ended up having to have a lot of long conversations about why the message is inappropriate. So the advocates from those state affiliates did their own cause a disservice by doing it the lazy way and by offending people. If you're going to have successful collaborations, it's going to require you to be courteous. And courtesy is almost always arbitrary. It doesn't always make sense. It's like masks. It's courteous to wear a mask if other people want you to wear a mask. In the same way that it's courteous to not swear around people that don't want you to swear. You have a right to ignore that person's feelings, ignore their preferences, and swear or not wear a mask and make a big deal of it. But you're unlikely to make any friends that way. And so when you're collaborating on an issue, I've found the most success in learning to bite my tongue on issues that are not important or relevant to the thing or would otherwise make other people in the coalition feel uncomfortable, right? There are people who won't work with you because of who you are. Those people are what they are. But there are other people who would work with you if you would just shut up about whatever unrelated thing makes them mad or offends them. And so learning how to bite your tongue or get that sense of where you're at and who you're with and what's appropriate for this venue, you know, courtesies are, they're what make the world go round. They're like the lubrication in an engine, right? You can blow up as much gas as you want, but if there's no oil lubricating those pistons, everything's going to burn up, right? You're going to create too much heat and too much friction to actually get the car down the road. So that lubrication is necessary for success. And I think that we need to all work a little more on trying to provide that so that that coalition that you're going to have at that march is even bigger, because you've removed all the obstacles to people that they might have had to working together with you. Does that make sense, James? And I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but I know you're going to a thing later today. And so you're dealing with this on an issue, this very same issue.
So we took a lot of those points into consideration as far as messaging at this rally. Mm-hmm. And we decided that, you know, the focus is really going to be a message for everyone, even people that show up there as anti-protesters. You know, our message is that we are against the government telling us how to make our own decisions which also includes the people that are okay with vaccinations and everything.
Right.
We're there to stand up for their rights just as much as our rights. We're there against the government telling us how to live our lives and how to make choices.
Yeah, I think,
and it wasn't a hard discussion to. Sure, those things did that certain messaging you referred to came up, and quick conversations. We decided, that's not what we're here to represent, and
right.
It doesn't help us in our main goal of collaboration.
Right.
And yeah, I think a lot of people understand that. The initial message that came out, yeah, sure, it did create some shock value and some interest, but it also created more conversation that it made our job harder. Like, we have to have more conversation now because of that, instead of just getting the issue out. And it happens. I mean,
here's what
we can't tell them how to message it.
So there's a couple things and then we'll close out on this because there may be other conversations that we want to go through. First, most people you meet don't have opinions on most issues. And it's hard for libertarians to really empathize with that, but I want to make it very clear. Most people don't know what they think about most things most of the time, because it's a very busy world we live in and they just don't care. So you have to be very careful with messaging that is strong and emotionally charged, because it will galvanize people to have an opinion who didn't previously have an opinion. And the problem is, if that's the only message they see, then now they have an opinion on the issue that's negative, and you never get a chance to talk to them again, because now that's a hard opinion, they're not interested. So that's what you have to be careful about, is that while it may have galvanized somebody to be on your side, it may have galvanized 10 people to be against you, and eventually you're just going to lose that way. The second thing is, there's an analogy my wife used in a social media post recently that really I think resonates and may be helpful to you, that libertarians pretty universally don't want to tell you how you should protect yourself and others, right? Whether it is your choice whether or not to use or own or carry a gun for protection, whether or not it is your choice to use or get a vaccination for protection, or masks, more vaccinations than masks, because that's an actual individual choice. And whether or not you choose to wear a motorcycle helmet or a seatbelt for protection, right? We believe that all three of those choices should be the individual's choice, and that we don't try and tell you to not do it, and we don't try and tell you to do it. Or we may tell you what we think you should do, we may advocate, but we always oppose the government coming in and making you pick one side or the other. And we have to be careful in our advocacy that we don't cross that line, which would make us more like Republicans and Democrats, where we know what we think is right for us, and we go and try and make other people think the way we think, right? There's a difference between saying, I want to have a choice whether or not to vaccinate myself, and then going into other people's spaces and saying, you shouldn't vaccinate, you're a terrible person, right? Or you should vaccinate and you're a terrible person for not. There's a line, and you want to try and make sure you stay on the right side of it. Brett, let's move on to another question, because I don't want to stick on one topic for too long.
Well, I was just going to ask if there's one, we probably have time for one more before we move into less formal post Q&A discussion that can probably be, that would not be included in the video. Looks like Nate, our secretary, has a question for you.
Thank you, Brett. And thank you again, Nick. I really love this. So you spoke a little bit about staying off of, I'll say, unrelated topics, but say you're working with someone, national debt, how could we bring someone from like one issue and educate them and get them on the right side of another? So like bring them from national debt to end the Federal Reserve.
So the way to do it is to have a successful working relationship on the one issue where you have enough interaction and shared work and collaboration that you build trust with the other person, right? It's very similar, you know, I'm not a huge fan of the military, although I have a lot of family members who are in it and I respect what they do. But one of the benefits of the military is when you are forced into a situation or you've chosen to go into a situation where you have this shared mission, you develop bonds of trust with the people you work with, and they take longer to develop. So hate is the lazy way to get people to have solidarity. If we all agree to hate the same person, same group, same thing, we're all together for a minute, right? It's why Orwell talked about 2 minutes hate in 1984. It's a way of forcing solidarity. The problem is hate has to be constantly fueled. You have to have some new outrage to get people back together because hate is it's not sticky. Shared work and collaboration will also build those same bonds that hate will, but they last a lot longer. There are people that I worked with in Maryland back in the early 2000s that I still have a deep connection with, in spite of us moving in very different directions for the rest of our lives, because that bond is stronger, it's formed over time. So I think having some success on the issue like the national debt then allows you the space to open up that conversation of, hey, the Federal Reserve by its very nature makes it easier for the national debt to get bigger. This is the unregulated spigot that is the reason we have this giant flood in the yard. So now that we've worked on the flood for a little bit and put up some sandbags and tried to mitigate the acute problem, let's go strike at the root of the thing and figure out how we can not flood the yard a second time, right? And that's kind of where this dovetails all the way back to, that's what LPI is about, is I don't want a solution that just is the Band-Aid. Like, for example, Elizabeth Warren wants to forgive a bunch of student loan debt. That is not actually a good solution, not because it won't solve the acute problem for people like myself and maybe Morgan. We'll get a break, but the same system that ballooned that debt in the first place is still there. It's still operating, right? It's only a matter of time before it gets back to this same broken state if you don't fix it farther upstream. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, Nick, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I want to remind everybody one more time that we'll be doing this once again next month. We do this the second Saturday of every month at 9 a.m., the Coffee Talks. Next Saturday, or the next time on May the 8th at 9 a.m., we'll be talking with Jess Mears about what it's like to have a career within the Liberty movement and the Libertarian Party specifically. And I want to encourage everybody who's in the current meeting, stick around for a little bit for a little more casual conversation. For those of you who are just catching this on the replay, definitely join us next month on May the 8th at 9 a.m. Eastern as we talk with Jess Mears. And we really appreciate those of you who made the time this morning as well. Thank you guys so much.